Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening lecture at the Siam Society under the royal patronage. I'm very delighted to see a very big crowd coming tonight for these very interesting lectures. The lecture today is Maymyo Days, Forgotten Lives of a Burma Hill Station. To me, as someone who loves Myanmar very dearly, this lecture has a very personal sentiment to me as well. So I'm very delighted to be here to introduce to you the speaker this evening. And Siam Society is greatly like to express the appreciation to H.W.J. Thompson Foundation for the great support of our lecture series of this year and next year. And for tonight's talk, the author is here with us, Mr. Stephen Simmons. I think he has a very interesting background. He spent in the early days a few decades of life in the military service. And I read something about his biography, and it says about HQ 48 Gurkha Brigade. So that's something to do with the British colonial already. And then later on, I think he pursued his career in investment, but I think his passion about researching on something about the colonial day has never stopped. And this is one of the very good, fine example that he kindly put together for us. He did wrote another book before called Club Classic in Asia Pacific 12 years ago. And I'm sure that will be an interesting title as well. After we listen to him tonight, perhaps you would go and try to find that title and read as well. So without further ado, may I present to you Mr. Stephen Simmons.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, sir. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you, the Siam Society, for having me to speak this evening. I've come to talk about a number of extraordinary people who lived in and around Maymyo in Burma. Different people, different walks of life. In fact, the only thing common to all of them was where they lived, drawn as they were to the Shan Hills. But may we quickly get names out of the way first. Some of you will use the name Myanmar, others Burma. Names are emotive and political. It's a terribly tricky country. In an earlier army life, I served in Northern Ireland, and the second city of the province is known by Unionists as Londonderry and by Nationalists as Derry. And if I had £1 for every time I saw a road sign with the name Londonderry crossed out and Derry inserted, and then back again the next day, I'd be a very rich man indeed. And to call Cambodia Kampuchea would, of course, for many, conjure up not so much an image of a country, but rather horrific memories of the Khmer Rouge and of genocide. Names are tricky. As many here will remember, Burma was run from 88 to 97 by the State Law and Order Restoration Council, which went by the highly appropriate Orwellian acronym of the SLORC. And it was the SLORC who changed the name to Myanmar, and the world has been in a pickle as to which name to use ever since. The country itself is divided. Supporters of the regime like the name Myanmar. Of course they do. Why would they not? Most of those who despise the regime, which includes many ethnic Burmans, do not, and the 32% of the population who are Karen, Mon, Kachin, Naga, and other minorities loathe the name as they see it as being ethnically exclusive. The West is all over the place over what to call it. The BBC has a Burmese service, but then a little confusingly, Radio 4 usually talks about Myanmar. The US government recently passed the Burma Act. The New York Times and The Guardian are absolutely Myanmar, and the Daily Telegraph seems to flip between the two. But key, at least for me, are the remnants of independent local media in the country, both minorities and Burman, who I listened to a while ago as they dialed in to the FCC here in Bangkok on Zoom, from darkened rooms, brave people hanging on like grim death and reporting as best can. and who operate under the Burma News International umbrella. For these people and for the Burma Human Rights Network, it's Burma. And given I've written about somewhere which some of those minorities inhabit, the Shan Hills, then Burma's good enough for me, certainly in the context of this book. And I ask for your forgiveness if for you it's Myanmar. Whilst the title of the book is Maymyo Days, it's really the subtitle, Forgotten Lives of a Burma Hill Station, which best describes what the book is about. I've written about some, as is the case with most of us, ordinary, normal people, but people who rose to do some extraordinary things. Some turned out to be gifted, a few courageous, others tragic. What it is not, what it was not intended to be, is an A to Z town guide of Maymyo. And had that been my aim, I would have fallen at the first hurdle, because whilst the authorities seemed to be quite happy for me to spend as long as I liked in Rangoon, which I did, and whilst the brief trip into the southern Shan states was easy, my internal travel permit got me no closer up the Mandalay Road to Maymyo than the Tokyan War Cemetery, and the same applied to the other recently retired army officer travelling with me. And arguing with authorities seldom, I have learnt over the years, arguing with authorities seldom, in fact never, helps, I find, ever. But travel difficulties mattered little, really, because I was writing not so much about the place, but about those forgotten lives. People long dead, and whose relatives are in places far flung from Burma, from Florence to Cambridge, from Kilkenny to New England. But I've also tried to explain just why they wound up in and around Maymyo and the hills. I've tried to explain just what the magnetic draw of those hills was, because hill stations were not built to be resorts, of course. Hill stations were at first simply about staying alive, because when the Europeans went east, they exposed themselves to exotic diseases, shall we say, such as malaria, dengue, typhus, and cholera, which promptly began to wipe them out. I recall looking at a brass plaque on the wall of the Wiggly Tin Garrison Church in Taiping, about 50 k's down the coast from Penang, which recorded the deaths of the wife and 3 children of a British Army officer, all lost to cholera in 1880 or thereabouts, within a few days of one another. And such brasses and such grave inscriptions are not at all uncommon, of course, in Southeast Asia. The colonial authorities needed to do something pretty quickly, given the mortality rates, and they did, which was to go up above 3,000 feet to the cool and above most of the mosquitoes. And the Dutch were first, building a hill station at Bogor, and to a degree it worked. So they built others, Bukit Tinggi on Sumatra, Kintamani on Bali. The East India Company followed with Uttarakhand, Simla and Darjeeling, followed by the colonial authorities in Malaya, with Fraser's Hill near KL, Maxwell's Hill near Taiping, and Strawberry Hill above Georgetown in Penang, and the French, of course, with Dalat and Bokor. And we must not forget, of course, our American cousins who built a hill station at Baguio, having acquired the Philippines from the Spanish after the 1898 Treaty of Paris. The price was $20 million, which I'm sure we would all agree was really quite a bargain for an entire country. But they did at least pay for it. Somewhat earlier, of course, the Europeans simply marched in. As tropical medicine improved and mortality rates fell, these hill stations began to exist almost purely as somewhere really rather nice to live. And so schools, hospitals, clubs, and churches were built, and many people spent almost their entire lives there, provided they had money, were European, or both. In Lords of the Sunset, Maurice Collis, a liberal left colonial officer, wrote that the British Empire was like an old country house which had been lived in by the same family for generations, and that each new generation had added in some way to the house by acquiring more possessions, in inverted commas, and that for no particularly good reason, absent-mindedness perhaps, some of the best and most beautiful acquisitions wound up not in the drawing room for all to see, but in the attic, tucked away and forgotten. The Shan states were, Fort Collis, stuck in the imperial attic. Now, there is in truth not enough to write a substantial book solely about the town of Maymyo itself anyway, I believe. There's without doubt scope for a travel magazine article, several have been written, which have added some kind of value, and that's the same for several hill stations. Fantastic to visit. Go to Strawberry Hill above Georgetown, I'm sure many of you have, but go to Strawberry Hill above Georgetown and bluff your way, as my wife and I did, into the now long-closed Crag Hotel. And you can easily imagine Somerset Maugham writing one of his short stories there, which he did. All very atmospheric, but never quite sufficient for a book. And the danger of a book about a hill station, an old hill station, anyway, is that it could very easily slip gently, if harmlessly, into becoming a little fluffy, perhaps. Nice houses here, fun drinks, parties there. Interesting in itself, without doubt, as most people do in truth enjoy a little social titillation, particularly if spiced up with a tad of scandal, sexual scandal, preferably, if you please. But such a book might, other than merely satisfy the perfectly understandable desire to amuse and titillate, such a book might lack any further real point or purpose. And the Shan Hills, or more accurately, some of the former inhabitants, offer more. The British Army almost stumbled upon Pinyulin, which was then a small Danu Hill tribe village, in 1886 after the capture of Mandalay at the end of the Third Anglo-Burmese War. To the British, it was another rather fine Strawberry Hill, and they established a more permanent military presence there, renaming the town Maymyo, or Maytown, after a chap called James May. He was a colonel in the 5th Bengal Infantry, became Maymyo's first military commander. Later in 1900, when the town was connected by rail to Mandalay and thence to Rangoon, it became the summer capital of the Raj, and they began to build large numbers of bungalows which were given a reminder of home names like Glenarm, inevitably Scott's, Pine Lodge, Oakhurst, and inevitably Rose Cottage. This is a family at Maymyo. What I know about them is not much. That house is Tapsey's villa, and that is the Merrick family. And that to die for bungalow, we all have our own architectural tastes, but for me that is a to die for bungalow. That photograph was taken by my friend Dominic Fulder, a photojournalist based in Bangkok, here this evening. And Dominic has contributed a few photographs of equal quality to my book, for which I'm extremely grateful. And the Candigreg, the old chummery of the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, chummery, civilian equivalent of officers' mess. Chums, all chums together, chummery. I first stumbled upon information about these people in Rangoon, finding old books in old bookshops and tea shops, often one and the same in Burma, old maps, photographs, bits of ephemera, which aroused my interest. It all got me thinking about Maymyo. What was the evident draw? And I just read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and in this book, a book about his time in the Spanish Civil War, he writes at one point about where? Maymyo. Extraordinary, really. A book about the Spanish Civil War, and there's Maymyo. Eric Blair, as he then still was, trained at the police training school in Mandalay, and he was subsequently posted to Maymyo for a while. And Orwell being Orwell, it would be difficult not to have one's interest at least partially aroused in the place, given his description, and particularly so, given his ordinarily scathing views on places, things, people related to the colonial regime. And then I read a scrap, which was all that was left from the diary of a former resident. She described Maymyo as being lost in the clouds. And I don't think she was referring solely to it being at 3,500 feet. She meant, I think, that it was detached from the ordinary, detached from the humdrum, really. In a stall in Scott's Market in Rangoon, in a pile of dusty old newspaper cuttings years ago, I came across half an article on this man, a Burmese soldier, a general, Po Ye, or to use the anglicised name which he used, Smith Dunn. General Smith Dunn is now completely out of the state's history books and is forgotten because he was not a Burman but a Karen. He's been airbrushed from official Burmese history. But what a soldier, what a very good soldier this man was. He won the Sword of Honour at the Indian Military Academy at Dehradun against competition from the likes of Sam Manekshaw, who later became a rightly exalted Indian Army Field Marshal. He was commissioned into the Punjabis, one of the first, if not the first, Burmese to gain a King's Commission. He fought against the wonderfully named or titled Fakir of Vipi on the northwest frontier. And if that is not straight out of Kipling, I don't know what is. He won a military cross fighting the Japanese in the Second World War with General Bill Slim's 14th Army, and he was also mentioned in dispatches. Now, we Brits get quite a lot wrong, but one of the things we don't get wrong is medals. No one gets a medal for getting up on time in the morning for 5 consecutive days. Medals are earned in the British Army. Every single one matters. That is why there is a spectacularly valuable and expensive aftermarket in medals. And this is Smith Dunn. That's a military cross on the left. Hard to earn, hard to earn. Campaign Medal Burma in the early 30s, Northwest Frontier, and then his 4 war medals. And the oak leaf is mentioned in dispatches. And he then became, just before the British left in 1948, the army commander, and then just after they left, commander-in-chief of all Burmese forces. He didn't last long in the job, however. He was, after all, not a Burman, but a Karen. And he was forced to hand over to his second-in-command, who happened to be, unsurprisingly, a Burman, by the name of Ne Win, who in 1962, of course, mounted the coup, which led the country into the military neo-socialist Stone Age from which it has never really emerged. Once forced out, Smith Dunn, like a good soldier, turned to the right and saluted, went quietly, even though, whilst leaving Rangoon for Maymyo, the regime had a go at killing him and his family by mortaring his car, unfortunately missing on the way to Mingladon Airport. He didn't complain about his treatment. He didn't get involved in politics. He simply retired from public life, and he spent the rest of his life not back in the Karen area near Bassein, where he was from, but in the Shan Hills, mainly in Maymyo, and a little later south in the smaller hill station of Kolor, which is where he died in 1979, aged 72. A little while later, whilst I was flicking through an old copy of the Irish Times, I stumbled upon this woman, Charlotte Wheeler Cuffe, an Anglo-Irish woman who was brought up in both leafy Sussex and in Ireland, and who married Otway Wheeler Cuffe, a Burma Public Works Department man, the PWD being the least glamorous of the services, but in truth probably the most important, given they were responsible for infrastructure in all its forms, and no infrastructure, of course, means no economy. They lived in Burma for decades, some of the time in Rangoon and Taipmyo, but most of it in Maymyo. She was a keen horticulturalist and amateur artist. Amateur. And yet she produced over 100 amazing watercolours of Burma's most exotic orchids and rhododendron, one of which had never been seen by a Westerner before, and which was named after her, and actually grew symbiotically on the branches of host trees. And she found this 9,000 feet up Mount Victoria in Chin State in the west, absolutely the back and beyond. And yes, she climbed it herself. Not that many pony trails then in that part of the world. Her paintings and her map making were superb. I'll just pause that a second so you can look at it. Absolutely beautiful. Wherever they were stationed, she drew a map, and her maps were so accurate that people came to copy them and use them as maps of the local area. That's how good she was. She was a cartographer as well as being an artist. Paintings of such quality, as you see, that they're now jealously guarded by the Botanic Gardens at Glasnevin in Dublin, some amateur. And then this woman, who was neither an engineer nor a landscape gardener, designed and oversaw the creation of what were at one time the world-famous Botanic Gardens in Maymyo, which still exist. And she did it pretty much on her own, because most men were either away dying on the Western Front, or if not there, they were in Burma doing the jobs of 2 or 3 men at the same time. So she was asked to take it on fully in 1917, and she did, and she completely succeeded using her own design and sketch map. That's her sketch map of the gardens. And that is the gardens on the right. Again, a photograph taken by Dominic Fulder. She was the designer, gangmaster, foreman, the lot. The Wheeler Cuffes left Burma in 1920 or 21. Otway, a victim of age-dictated mandatory retirement, comes to us all, I suppose. And they went home to Ireland, from where her letters suggested that while settled, their hearts remained absolutely in the Shan Hills. Then a little later, whilst ferreting around for something else, in an old copy of the Malay Straits Times, I learned of one Henry Morshead. And if any of you here are mountain climbers, you've probably heard of Henry Morshead. That's him on the left, and that's him with his family up in Maymyo. He was Royal Engineers, a lieutenant colonel, a twice-wounded World War I winner of the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, and he mapped goodness knows how much of northern India whilst working for the Survey of India in the years before the First War, working for these people. He took part in some grueling expeditions, including a 1,700-mile circuitous trek to chart the top reaches of the Brahmaputra River, a feat lauded hugely by the Royal Geographical Society. He climbed Everest almost, but not quite to the top, with the great George Mallory, and lost several fingers and toes in the process. That's a photograph of Morshead with the Everest recce climbing team. Morshead is front right as you look at it. George Mallory is front left. Second left rear is Charles Howard Berry of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, who was the expedition leader. Barking mad Brits, they're all wearing tweeds and ties, trying to climb up Everest. Extraordinary photograph. Morshead was stationed and then, to all intents and purposes, settled in Maymyo with his family after a few more expeditions to seemingly impossible places. Then in May 1931, whilst waiting for his wife to return from England, she having put one of their children into boarding school, he was murdered in Maymyo, found dead one morning out in the rides with a gunshot wound to his chest and a lesser wound to his back, but a major gunshot wound to his chest. All sorts of theories as to who the killer was followed, which I have in the book, but he or she, the killer, was never found. And that's where he wound up in Maymyo. Oops. And then a contact in Maymyo made me aware of these two extraordinary ladies. Two princesses, Yadana Mai and her mother, Princess Malat. Princess Malat was a Shan. She'd been exiled to India with her family by the British after her family were involved in the resistance in the Shan states in the 1880s. A little while after the family were permitted to return to Burma, Malat became engaged to the Crown Prince of Sikkim. This chap. Sikkim being a British-controlled statelet up near Nepal. This was an unusual engagement in that Sikkimese princes usually married either Sikkimese or Tibetan women, usually the latter, from what I can see. Just weeks before the marriage was due to take place, the prince died of, quote, heart failure, supervening an attack of jaundice brought on by a chill, in his palace in the capital, Gangtok. He was in his mid-30s and seemingly otherwise fit and healthy. Odd, really. This is one of Marlat's last letters to him, 1914, I think. It's an extraordinary letter, microcosms of language and time. Heaps of best love. Could have been written by an English public school girl in the 1970s. Extraordinary. Marlat resigned herself to being, very cruel expression, left on the shelf. But one day at the Rangoon races, she met and later married an Australian buccaneering type by the name of Herbert Bellamy, and they went to live in Maymyo, where Marlat had her only child, Yadana Mai, or June Bellamy, to give her her other Anglo name. She grew up to be an absolute beauty. She turned down the offer of playing opposite Gregory Peck in the screen adaptation of H.G. Bates' The Purple Plane, a book about an RAF pilot shot down over Burma in the war. Brilliant book if you haven't read it. She thought the over-Hollywoodization of the film patronizing. Given what could have flowed from their part, that showed some serious moral courage on her part. Then she met and married an Italian who was one of the world's leading malaria specialists working for the UN in the Shan Hills. And extraordinary courage, she personally delivered the ransom money when her husband was kidnapped by the Communist Party of Burma fighters in the late 50s. She actually took the money herself into the jungle. The army, constantly outfought by the CPB, would not provide an escort for her, so she went on her own. Guts. After a tempestuous 1960s, she left Burma, poetically almost on the last remaining Burma Airways plane considered airworthy by the European countries over which it would fly. This is her in later life. She died just a couple of years ago. And in fact, the foreword to this book was written by her Shan Italian son, Michele Postiglione, or to use his Shan name, Tenlin Ong. And I know my Italian pronunciation, and I know my Burmese pronunciation was appalling on both of those, so forgive me. He is now the Limbin Prince. I've written briefly about Felice Beato, not a well-known name now, unless you happen to have studied photography at college. But his photographs constituted the standard imagery of India and of Southeast Asia, as found in newspapers and magazines for much of the late 1800s. He pretty much shaped many people's perceptions of the East. Although he was a frequent visitor to the hills, he didn't actually live there. He lived in Mandalay. So as much as I would like to, I cannot stretch authorial license or spin to the extent of including him substantially. But I was given very generous access to a private cache of his photographs, many of which have not been seen before. So I would, of course, have been quite nuts not to include him. So I have, briefly. And, of course, some of his photographs. There's a famous photograph of the aftermath of the storming of the Secundrabad at Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny, or First War of Independence, depending on how you view it. Stormed by the 93rd Highlanders and the Punjabis. Cannonballs and bodies everywhere, reproduced in umpteen books. It was his. He was in the Crimea a little earlier, and some, if not all, of the famous shots of the Valley of Death, through which charged the Light Brigade, are his. These are a few of his taken in the 1880s in Burma from this private cache. Charming photograph of obviously a number of girls outside a temple. Very grand Burmese woman with her entourage with her. I note that at least 4 of them are smoking cheroots. Good old days. That was the suppression, really, of the Shan states in about 1885, 1886. Don't know the regiment, I think Royal Berkshires, but it's a Beato photograph. If you're a dacoit and got caught, dacoits, of course, bandits. What do bandits do? They prey on poor people, essentially. If you're a bandit and you're a dacoit and you were caught by the British Army, you at least had a bit of a fair crack. These guys are banged up in a stockade. They're chained. They'll go in front of a judge and they'll probably spend a lot of time in jail. But they preyed on poor people, as bad guys always do. When the poor people actually managed to get hold of them, this is what they did to them. And there are others in the book which time precludes me from going into any depth now. Elephant Bill, as he became known, he fought for 4 years with the Devons in the First War. Should have been dead. 4 years. Statistically, he was dead, given the mortality rate of British officers in the First War. He fought for 4 years with the Devons, got a job with the Bombay Burma Corporation on demob, on leaving the army, and spent much of his life in the Burma jungles and teak forests, and then in World War II found himself in Force 136 in Burma, deploying his elephants in support of Slim's 14th Army, before which he trekked 70 women and children out of the country to India when the Japanese invaded. Then he said goodbye to his wife and went back to the war. The artist in the book was not an artist by profession at all. He was a solicitor. But one who became heavily involved in, and he probably started in Burma, what we would today call microfinance, i.e. affordable loans to small businesses, which would ordinarily pay huge interest rates on their loans. Microfinance, I accept, does not get the pulse racing. But this was properly good work, and maybe a century ahead of its time, ahead of the pack. He lived here in Maymyo, that's him, and he lived here, lucky chap, in this gorgeous house. And he painted Burma and its people of its time and of their time. That's a Chuprasa, or an orderly, and a Kachin military policeman. The steamer on the Irrawaddy obviously would have been the Irrawaddy Flotilla Company. And to demonstrate to you that he was not just an old buffer, whiling away his time in the hills, here is what he thinks of a real old British buffer who fantasized that he really did chase away mutinous Kachins. That's him on the left, bottle of wine in one hand, sabre in the other, blood coming off the sabre. Swinhoe obviously didn't like him because in the bottom right-hand corner he's written, most poisonous chap. And that's the same fellow boring everyone to death in the bar with his war stories of how incredibly brave he was. The writer in the book is Beth Ellis. Beth lived with her sister for a while in Maymyo, his sister May being married to one of the Heaven-born, as they were known, an Indian civil service man. So inspired did Beth become by living there in those hills that she was driven to write. She wrote an amusing, gently satirical book, an old dog-eared copy of which I stumbled upon in Penang, at the Penang Club actually, about the Hill Station and about Burma types, and she became a successful author, a career curtailed by early death in childbirth in 1913 when she was only 39 years old. And then there were others up in the Shan Hills about whom it is difficult to discover very much of any substance, or in some cases, very much at all. Too much time passed, too many gin slings under the bridge. A former subaltern by the name of Brian, Irish Guards, I believe, mutilated so badly on the Western Front that he quite understandably sought quiet solace, but he sought it not in a remote corner of Ireland, but on the edge of a lake at the southern end of the Shan Hills. An artist by the name of E.G. McCall, an Anglo-Burmese born in Maymyo to a High Court judge and his Burmese wife. He fought in the First War, returned to Maymyo, and stayed well into the 1960s. Some of his paintings later, after his death, went for sale at Sotheby's, which gives you an idea. And a retired Indian Army officer by the name of Colin Henriques, 21st Punjabis, went to Mesopotamia in the First War with the Kachin. Actually, I think he was largely responsible for the creation of the Kachin Rifles, a wonderful regiment. He retired to write, and he wrote successfully, not in Cheltenham, however, but in Magog, at the northern end of the Shan Hills. It came to an end for some of them because of the usual cholera, dysentery, and malaria. A couple of graves there. Now, cause of death, of course, never on the grave, but if you look at the when, and if you look at the age, it was obviously going to be one of those diseases which did for them. It came to an end for most of them when they were invited to leave rather forcefully by the invading Japanese army in 1942. Some came back, just a handful really. Two of them shown here at the end of it all. But then came independence in 1948. Some stayed on, and one or two Brits even returned. I came across a woman by the name of Gladys Childers, who went back and whose return demonstrates so clearly the pull of those Shan Hills. She was married to a Colonel Hugh Childers, who had been Indian Army, 32nd Lancers. They lived in Colour, and he was killed commanding a battalion of the Burma Frontier Force in 1941, when the Japanese invaded. She was in a POW camp for 3 years, repatriated to England in 1945, but then returned to Burma in 1952 when she was 63 years old. You've really got to want to go back somewhere where your husband was killed and is buried, in a country which is post-independence under an already hardline regime, where almost everyone you knew is either dead or has left, and where title to your house is really at the whim of the state. In the event, she lasted only a few years, poor woman, and then the rigours of the war and of the camps took their toll. And then came in Ne Win in 1962, and that was pretty much the end of everything. Writing about another, for some, glorious period, the Anglo-Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen, writing of her pre-Irish Civil War childhood summers spent in County Cork, described the image in her mind of that idyllic childhood, so long past, so utterly irretrievable, so completely then, as sunshine elsewhere or firelight in an empty room. That's how it was for many who lived in the Shan Hills too, I think. Nothing stays the same, of course, and after Maymyo and the hills, life for most of them was almost certainly no longer quite so lost in those clouds. Thank you for your time.
Do you have any idea what the state of the town is now? Does it play any kind of resort-like role currently? Are there interesting people within the bounds of what could maybe pre the current Civil War, but be coming and going, or is it kind of just a bygone place?
The one contact I have there, who has lived there for many years and is a teacher, tells me that I wanted a couple of extra photographs of graves at the Garrison Church. He lives about 500 yards from there. He couldn't get there. It's too dangerous. I mean, that I think answers. I think it's in a terrible state. Would you not agree, Dominic? Yeah, it's in a terrible state. And I think it's probably getting worse as the insurrection come civil war worsens.
Thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about the climate. We assume that it's cooler there, but how much cooler than it would have been in Yangon? And also, what kind of plants would you have found there? Why was it so attractive to the British?
Attractive to the British primarily because wherever the Brits were, they wanted a hill station. They wanted to get away from the heat. They wanted to get away from the central plains of India. They wanted to get away from down on the coast in Malaya, as was. They needed to get up to the height, particularly in the hot months, and they wanted to get up to the heights. They wanted to get up to the cool, and really the magic number is about 3,000 feet. 3,000 feet, and it's quite cool. and the temperature in Maymyo and the soil was sufficiently bang on for them to be able to grow roses and to grow strawberries. And in fact, Orwell talks about ladies presenting him, trying to sell him strawberries in these large baskets when he went up there. I hope that answers. Over 3,500 feet, actually the air starts getting thin. I was in Nanyuki in Kenya some years ago, Kenya, and that's at 6,000 feet. You've got to have pretty good lungs, actually, if you were there for a considerable period of time, because the oxygen's really quite thin. 3,500 feet is the magic number. Funnily enough, most of the hill stations are at 3,500 feet. Yeah.
Perhaps you could just say something about the Services Academy, which is in Maymyo today, in the late 40s, and the role it plays with the training of the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military.
Right. As I understand it, I'm not an expert on that academy, but as I understand it, well, what that was when the Brits were there was an NCO and junior officer training school, but primarily a junior NCO training school. The Burmese moved their officer training school up to Maymyo, and it has been there ever since, and it's in the old British lines. Hence the fact that Maymyo very often, particularly to ex-military people or any government-related people, I think, is largely out of bounds because it's full of secrets. And very often, if there are helicopters buzzing about, as my contact in Maymyo was telling me, if there are helicopters buzzing about, it's a few generals flying in, all of whom, or many of whom, have really rather nice houses in Maymyo, funnily enough. So it's their Defence Services Academy. It is their Sandhurst. It's their West Point.
Actually, that leads me to maybe you can recap how you got interested in that specific spot on the globe, your intro as well as to the book. It's clear you've been many, many, many exotic and interesting places. What drew you to write a book about that spot?
Really, it was that general, Poye. I've read so much, having been in the army for quite a long time, I've read an awful lot about Slim's 14th Army and about various other campaigns. And you read a lot about British generals, and you read a lot of books about large armies, huge formations, 4 corps right, 3 div left, 2 div up the middle, etc., etc., etc. The human level is certainly a far greater interest to me. One reads about Slim, about Messervy, etc. One reads other times the Americans will read about Stilwell. I came across this scrap of paper about a Burmese general, and he was a man who was a damn good soldier. He I found particularly interesting, and what he did with the 14th Army. The service I won't go into detail about it now because it's really quite sort of intricate stuff, but he was operating in the west of Burma in Chin State, and he and his company were, without being graphic about it, extremely successful in the war with the Japanese. He was extremely successful and a very brave man. And that military cross, those military crosses do not come up with the rations. They've got to be earned. And so when I read the scrap of paper about this man, and it included that photograph of him, I thought that needs a bit of research. It sort of carried on from there, really. But also, I'd been a bit of an Orwell addict. Burmese Days, obviously, I'm sure most people have read that here. And then I met somebody. It's a wonderful book. But then I met somebody who's actually helped with this book, whose family lived in Maymyo, who completely disputes the characterization of the Brits which Orwell describes in Burmese Days. Yeah. So it really started with General Poye, Smith Dunn, great man.
Thank you, Stephen, for the talk. Not for the question, but just want to help with some of the question asked by the audience. Because I come from Myanmar, and I have some, I know the town. As Maymyo has been quite a military training base. I'm not sure it's since in the British time that is a military training site or not, but after the independence that the Myanmar government has inherited some of the land, and then that other military schools are also expanding. So it's quite a large area has been occupied by the military ownership. And Maymyo was very nice hill station resort town, because when British lay out the town, it's not all the straight. It's quite a romantic layout with a very nice streets and the large plots with the big houses, as you showed in your presentation. But nowadays, it's because it's only 42 miles away from Mandalay, and Mandalay has been quite a business city and a lot of Chinese investment. And now, because of the roads are improved, and only 1 hour, over an hour to Maymyo. So Mandalay is very hot, the city, and the Maymyo 1 hour away is quite cold after 1 hour. So many has been investing into Maymyo, and then because of not really good management in land use, it has been quite messy. Few years, the lands has been appropriated or just subdivided the farmland and forest land to sold out. So what has been happening these few years is Maymyo even faced the flood. That never happened in the station town. Mm-hmm. So that needs to be reviewed, I was suppose. And a lot of commercial recreational facility, but otherwise it's like an organic farm or coffee farm or the flowers. Mm-hmm. Many horticulture businesses are there too. Yeah, that's the update. Thank you.
And a very good update. Thank you.
Then thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. I think for us, it's very difficult to try to dig out and really talk about someone's life as if you were your friends, they are your friends. I think this is amazing, and best wishes for the book. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, goodness me.
I have a little gift for you from Siam Society. Goodness me.